He gathered later that she was considering something, whether to go back to the band, whether to continue south alone, whether the situation at the camp was something she needed to be there for. He did not press her reasoning. He worked the ranch, and she helped him work the ranch, and they talked in the way of people who are carefully finding the edges of each other's territory, which is a slow process but a real one. The town came into it about 10 days after the storm. He needed to go into Tularosa for supplies, grain mostly, and a new bit for the sorrel gelding who had been working with a bit that didn't fit right. He would be back by evening. When he returned, the evening was settling and cold and the house was warm, and there was venison stew in the pot, and the fire was built exactly right, not too high, not too low, the way a person builds a fire when they've had occasion to manage one on their own. The complication came in the form of his nearest neighbor, a man named Garrett Voss, who ran cattle 6 miles east and had come to the territory a year before Wyatt and considered himself, on that basis, something of a founding voice in how things ought to be done in the area. Voss had been to Tularosa on the same day and had come back past the ranch on his way home, intending to return a bridle he'd borrowed in October. He'd knocked. Ayanna had opened the door. Voss hadn't said anything to Wyatt directly. He'd looked past Ayanna, muttered something about returning the bridle another time, and left. But Wyatt knew Voss well enough to understand that this was the beginning of something rather than the end of it. 3 days later a man named Ruiz from the general store came out to deliver a message, which he said he was doing as a courtesy. The message was from Reverend Holt at the church in Tularosa, who wanted Wyatt to understand that the town had certain expectations regarding the conduct of its citizens, and that the presence of a reservation Indian in a white man's house in an unclear capacity was the kind of thing that tended to create problems. Wyatt thanked Ruiz for the ride and closed the door. He did not bring any of this up with Ayanna immediately. She noticed him quieter than usual that evening and put the question directly. He laid it out for her. She listened without a visible change in expression. When he finished, she put it plainly, she'd expected this. He figured she might. What will you do? He looked at the fire. What I'm doing. She watched him. There may be consequences. There usually are. He picked up the piece of harness he'd been working on. I didn't bring you in to have you moved along at someone else's convenience. You're here because you were dying in my snow, and you stayed because you chose to stay, and those are the only relevant facts. That's a simple way of seeing it. I know. I'm a simple man. He put it without self-deprecation, the way you state a tool's intended use. She almost smiled. He saw it as a shift in the muscles around her eyes rather than an actual expression. Then she told him she would stay. Reverend Holt came out himself the following week, on a gray afternoon when the sky was promising more weather and the mountains to the north were already lost in cloud. He arrived at the front gate on a mule and said he'd come to call, and Wyatt let him in because keeping a man standing at the gate in the cold felt unnecessarily hostile. He brought Holt inside, sat him at the table, and put coffee in front of him. Holt was a small, careful man in his late 50s who had come to the territory from somewhere in Virginia and had the manner of a person who considers himself a moderating influence on rougher people. He gave his piece in careful language. That the territory was still finding its way in terms of how different communities would learn to coexist, that social arrangements which transgressed the understood norms created friction that was bad for everyone, that he was not speaking against the Apache people as a people but only noting that certain situations, however they came about, created the appearance of impropriety. Wyatt listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When Holt finished, Wyatt put his position plainly. He'd found a woman dying in a blizzard and brought her in. She was a guest in his house. He was not in the habit of explaining his hospitality to his neighbors. Holt tried another angle, reputation, the difficulty of doing business in a community where a man had made himself controversial, how Wyatt might find it harder to sell cattle or source credit if the town had questions about his judgment. Wyatt looked at him without particular emotion and delivered a simple answer. He'd sell cattle somewhere else. Holt left without finishing his coffee. Ayanna had been in the barn during the visit. She came in when the mule was gone and poured the unfinished coffee back into the pot. Her read on it was direct: Holt would not stop. Wyatt agreed, probably not. The town would make things difficult for him. The town, he pointed out, had been making things difficult for her people for a good while longer. He hung his coat by the door and said he'd manage. She looked at him with something he couldn't quite categorize, not gratitude, not assessment exactly, but something closer to the moment before a decision. Like a person at the edge of a high place who has not yet committed to the step. Winter settled hard over the Sacramento mountains in December. The cold was serious, nights below zero, days that barely climbed to 20, the kind of cold that finds every gap in a structure and comes through it. Wyatt worked the ranch in the mornings and Ayanna worked it alongside him, not because he asked and not because she needed to, but because she was that kind of person, the kind who reads what needs doing and does it without making an event of it. She was skilled in ways that were immediately useful. She knew the mountain plants that treated cold and chest problems, which mattered because the sorrel gelding developed a respiratory illness in December, and the treatments she prepared from pine needles and dried herbs addressed it more effectively than what Wyatt had been doing. She knew how to process hide in ways that produced material better suited to the cold than the commercial leather goods he'd been relying on. She had an eye for terrain. For reading where the snow would drift deep and where it would blow clear, for knowing which routes would stay passable and which would close. In exchange, and without being asked, she taught him things about the country that weren't in any book and weren't available from his neighbors. Which springs stayed open in the deep winter, where the elk moved when they came down from altitude, how to read the particular coloration of a late afternoon sky that meant dangerous cold was coming in the night rather than in the morning. He'd been in the territory 3 years and thought he knew it reasonably well. He understood, over the course of that December, that he'd known it the way you know a place you've moved through, as opposed to the way Ayanna knew it, which was the way you know a place that has been in your family for generations. He tried to say this to her one evening and got the words slightly wrong. He put it that her family had been here a long time. She corrected him precisely: her grandmother was born on this mountain. Her great-grandmother walked these slopes looking for the same plants she was using now. A pause. This was not his country in the same way it was hers. He knew it. But you are here. And you are not the worst of what came. He understood that was not exactly a compliment, but it was as close to one as the honest situation allowed, and he respected it more than flattery would have earned. The tribe's suspicion of him had its own shape, distinct from the town's. Where the town's disapproval was about propriety and the disruption of established social arrangements, the Day elder and the people around her had real and specific reasons to distrust a white rancher in the Sacramento mountains in 1881. Those reasons were not theoretical. They were written in recent memory and older memory and in the composition of the camp itself. Fewer people than there should have been, fewer horses, stores taken by strangers in uniform on the basis of suspicion that proved unfounded. He did not present himself to them as someone who deserved trust on any grounds other than demonstrated behavior. He showed up when he said he would, brought what he said he'd bring, and let whatever conclusions they drew arrive on their own time. He went back to the camp twice more in December, each time with supplies, and once with the information that a cavalry patrol was moving through the lower valley and was likely to come north. The elder received this with the same careful neutrality with which she received everything else about him, which he understood as a reasonable position. But on the second trip, one of the young men at the camp, a serious-faced person about Ayanna's age who turned out to be her cousin, a man named Nantan, came to stand near him while he unloaded and put something into English. Ayanna spoke well of him. Wyatt looked up from the unloading. That was something, he answered. Nantan pressed a little further. She was not an easy person to convince of anything. She had decided about Wyatt in 3 days, which was fast for her. Wyatt received this intelligence and put forward only that she was a remarkable person. Nantan looked at him with the particular directness that seemed to run in this family and delivered a simple instruction: yes. Don't forget it. The crisis came in late January. The issue had been building for a while in the form of a man named Marcus Kane, who ran the largest cattle operation in the county and whose family had been in the territory long enough to have developed opinions about how it should be organized. Kane had not approached Wyatt directly but had been working through the social layer, and by late January there was a current of pressure in the county that Wyatt could feel without being able to confront, because it existed in the form of missed greetings and withdrawn credit and the general social withdrawal that precedes more concrete action. On a Tuesday in late January, Kane rode up to the ranch house with 4 of his hands and tied off at the gate. Wyatt came out on the porch. Kane was a big man in his 50s who had the confidence of someone who had not been seriously crossed in a long time. He laid his position out plain. Wyatt's arrangement with the Apache woman was bad for the county, bad for property values, bad for the general project of maintaining the kind of orderly civilization that made it possible for decent people to build lives in the territory. He wanted Wyatt to send her back to whatever reservation she'd come from. He delivered it with the tone of someone conferring a decision rather than requesting an action. Wyatt looked at him for a long time. "She's not going anywhere." "I'm not asking." "Neither am I." There was a moment in which the situation was assessing itself, the way certain moments do, finding the next thing to be. Kane's hands were not reaching for anything, which meant this was still in the range of words. What happened next was that Ayanna came out of the house. She came through the door with the calm of a person who has been following a conversation and has decided to be present in it rather than absent from it. She stood on the porch beside Wyatt, not behind him, not slightly back, but at his shoulder, and she looked at Kane with eyes that had seen enough of this particular human type to be wholly unimpressed by it. "You're welcome to leave now." Kane looked at her. He looked at Wyatt. "This is my house," Wyatt put it to him. "Which means it's her house. Which means we'll ask you once politely to ride out, and after that we'll find some other way to end this conversation." There was another of those assessment moments. Kane made his calculation, and he and his men rode out. Wyatt did not feel the relief until they were past the tree line. He turned and looked at Ayanna. She looked back at him with that almost expression that was becoming a map he was learning to read. He'd called it her house, she pointed out. "I said it. You didn't have to say it that way." "No. I know." She was quiet a moment. The cold was serious, and they were both standing on the porch in it without coats, which was the kind of detail that only registers after the fact. She looked at the tracks Kane's horses had left in the fresh snow. Then she said his name, and he answered, and she told him she would like to stay. Not as a guest. As a person who belonged here. He understood what she was saying. He understood the weight of it, and he had been slow to speak certain things aloud because speaking certain things aloud is irreversible, and he was by nature careful about irreversible things. But there was a kind of logic to the situation that had been arriving quietly for 8 weeks and was now fully present. "I would like that." She studied him. She wanted him to know she would not be a quiet wife. She would disagree with him. "Good," he put back, "he made mistakes." She looked at the mountains. Neither of them moved toward the door. Finally she said her family would need to be consulted, and he answered that they should go consult them. She turned to look at him fully, which she did not always do, and in her expression he saw the thing he had been seeing in pieces for 8 weeks, whole and unobstructed for perhaps 3 seconds. Then she turned toward the door. "Get your coat." The consultation with the elder and with Nantan and the other people in Ayanna's family whose opinion mattered was not a simple afternoon's conversation. It happened over 3 visits and occupied a week. Wyatt did most of his communicating through Ayanna, which was limiting, but on the 3rd visit the elder surprised him by addressing him directly in English that was more precise than he'd expected. She wanted to know what he understood about the responsibilities of a husband. He gave the same answer he'd give about being a neighbor: you showed up when it mattered, you did what you said, you didn't make the other person's life harder by your presence. The elder looked at him for a long time. "That is a low bar." I know. But I clear it consistently. Something shifted in the elder's face that was not quite a smile and was not nothing. She spoke to Ayanna, who relayed the verdict: consistent men are worth more than impressive ones. The wedding was a small thing by either community standards, which was appropriate since neither community was entirely comfortable with it. They did it twice, once in the Apache way with the elder and Nantan and the 4 other members of Ayanna's family who had made the ride south, and once with a territorial judge who came through Tularosa on circuit and whose inclination toward legal formality was stronger than his inclination toward social commentary. Garrett Voss did not come. Reverend Holt did not come. Marcus Kane made no further appearances. The people who came were few, and mostly they were people Wyatt had not expected to find in his corner: the blacksmith from Tularosa, a man named Henrik who had come from Germany and did not have strong opinions about the correct organization of territory society. A ranch woman named Constance who had been homesteading alone north of town for 4 years and who showed up with a cast-iron pan and the opinion that the business was nobody's concern but the people involved in it. And 2 of Ayanna's band who had made the long ride from the winter camp and who brought dried venison and a blanket with a pattern that Ayanna explained was specific to marriages, the particular design indicating a partnership between people who came from different directions and had found common ground. He looked at the blanket for a long time. "It's beautiful," she explained. Her grandmother had made that pattern. It was used when a marriage crosses a boundary. Mountain to valley, warrior to healer, different bands. Her grandmother would not have expected it to be used for this. He asked if that bothered her. She considered the question with the seriousness she gave to questions that deserved it, then, no. Her grandmother understood that patterns carry. That you make a thing for one purpose and it serves another one later, because the world keeps changing. She would have liked that it was used. They put the blanket over the bed that evening. The spring came in March with a suddenness that the winter made seem miraculous, snow still in the hollows and the passes while the south-facing slopes went green in 2 weeks, the creek running strong and clear with snowmelt, the horses moving out of their winter lethargy into the particular restlessness of animals remembering what the warm months feel like. Frozen and barely breathing, she would have been dead before morning, the woman he would marry before the winter was out, though the county never saw it coming, and neither did he. Her name was Ayanna. His name was Wyatt. The night he lifted her from the snow was the night everything changed for both of them, in ways neither could have predicted when the blizzard started. That was the winter of 1881, New Mexico Territory, deep in the Sacramento Mountains where the altitude sits above 7,000 feet and the cold does not arrive gradually. It arrives like a wall. Wyatt Dawson was 31 years old, a cattle rancher who had come to the territory 3 years before with a borrowed stake and a second-hand remuda, and had built something worth keeping through nothing more than stubbornness and early mornings. Ayanna was 23, a western Apache woman of the day whose band had been pushed from their winter camp by a cavalry patrol that had taken their seasoned stores and left them with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the mountains ahead. Neither of them knew, on that particular night in late November, that the blizzard coming off the Guadalupes was going to force them into each other's lives in a way from which there was no clean exit. This is how it happened. The storm came in from the west without the usual warning signs. Wyatt had spent the morning riding the fence line on the north pasture, checking posts he'd set in September, and the sky was clear enough that he didn't think to head back early. By 2 in the afternoon the clouds were on him, not rolling in but appearing, the way weather in that country sometimes just materializes out of nothing, and by 3 the visibility had dropped to the length of his arm. He got his horse turned south toward the ranch house and moved at a walk, because moving faster in zero visibility was how a man broke a horse's leg in a ditch. The temperature, which had been cold enough in the morning, dropped 20 degrees in under 2 hours. He felt it through his coat, through his gloves, through the wrapped scarf he kept tied across the lower half of his face when the wind was serious. This wind was serious. He found her 70 yards from his front gate. She was lying in a hollow where the fence wire ran closest to the tree line, and he almost rode past her. The snow was already an inch thick on her coat, and the dark of her clothing had blended with the exposed roots of a juniper that had blown down some years before. His horse shied slightly to the left, which was what made him look. The roan mare he called Dawn had an instinct for things on the ground that Wyatt had never trained into her. She'd caught 2 rattlesnakes that way over the years, and when she shied, Wyatt learned to pay attention. He dismounted in the driving wind and went to one knee in the snow. He pressed 2 fingers against the side of her neck and found a pulse, faint but there, and he felt the particular quality of her skin the way you feel the temperature of a piece of iron, not just cold, but deeply cold, the kind that has penetrated past the surface and settled into the core. Her lips were the color of a bruise. Her breathing was so shallow he could barely detect it against the noise of the wind. He did not deliberate. He got both arms under her and lifted. She was not a small woman, full-figured, tall by the standards of the territory, and the dead weight of someone truly unconscious is a different thing from the weight of a person who is merely asleep. He got her across the saddle and held her steady with one arm while he walked the last 70 yards home, leading the mare with his free hand, his boots punching through the crust of the snow with every step. He got her inside, got the door shut against the wind, and took stock. The fire in the main room had burned down but was not out. He built it up fast, cedar bark first, then split pinyon, then 2 larger pieces of pine, and moved her to the bench nearest the hearth. He worked quickly because the urgency of it was plain to any person who'd spent a winter at altitude. She had been out long enough to be past shivering, which meant the shivering reflex had given out, and a body that has stopped shivering is a body that has stopped fighting. He stripped the wet outer layers, the sodden buckskin coat, the blanket sheet had wrapped around her shoulders that was now frozen stiff, and covered her with the 2 wool blankets from the bedroom shelf. He put a second piece of pine on the fire, pulled the bench closer to the hearth, close enough that the heat was immediate, then sat on the floor beside her and waited. He had no idea who she was. He could see from the cut of her moccasins and the particular beadwork on the pouch still looped at her waist that she was Apache, Western Apache by the pattern, but the Sacramento Mountains in 1881 had seen enough movement of bands. Enough displacement and relocation, people pushed off one strip of land and onto another, that being Apache in these mountains in November told you nothing specific about where she'd come from or where she was headed. He did not think about any of that. He thought about the color of her lips and whether the warmth was reaching her fast enough. About an hour into it, she started to shiver again. He understood that as a good sign. The shivering meant the body was fighting back, meant the core temperature was coming up, meant the reflex had returned. He kept the fire fed. He heated water in the cast iron pot and held a warm cloth to her hands, then her feet, working his way inward the way he'd been taught by an old man in Arizona who had survived 2 nights of exposure and considered himself an authority on the subject. He had no warm broth ready because he hadn't been expecting company, but he put a pot of water on with some dried venison and waited for it to become something she could drink. She came around in the 2nd hour. Not all at once. First her breathing changed, deeper, more regular, the labored quality of something mechanical becoming something natural. Then her hands moved. One of them, the left, made a small gripping motion around the edge of the blanket, the way a person's hands sometimes move before the rest of them catches up. Then her eyes opened, and she looked at the fire before she looked at anything else. When she finally looked at him, her eyes were dark and clear and completely awake. She had the eyes of a person who comes back from something difficult and immediately needs to know where they are. He stayed still. He kept his hands in view, resting on his knees, not reaching toward her, not drawing back. He explained the situation in plain words. She'd been down in the snow, he'd brought her in, the storm was still going, the way you'd explain a simple fact to someone whose language you weren't sure of. She looked at the fire. She looked at the ceiling. She looked at the door, which was barred against the storm. Then she looked at him again. Water. One word, precise, in English. He got up slowly, without sharp movements, and poured a cup from the kettle at the edge of the hearth, warm, not hot. He carried it to her and set it within her reach rather than handing it directly, giving her the choice of whether to take it. She took it, drank, paused, drank again, and he could see in the steadying of her hand that the warmth was reaching something inside that needed it. Her name came on the third swallow. Ayanna. He gave his back. Wyatt Dawson. This was his house. She took that in as a reasonable thing to have confirmed. Then she wanted to know about the blizzard, and he told her it was still coming down hard. She couldn't have walked out of here tonight even if she were fit to walk. She looked at the window, which showed nothing but white, and made a small sound that was close to agreement. He put the simple question, was she hurt beyond the cold? She took inventory the way certain people do. Not anxiously but systematically, the way a person moves through a checklist. She flexed her hands, one then the other. She moved her feet inside the blanket. She pressed 2 fingers briefly to her right side, paused, and appeared to decide the pain there was not going to become meaningful in the next few hours. Not hurt, she concluded. He moved back to the fire and gave her the distance of the room. Venison broth was on, she could sleep on the bench, he'd take the floor. She made no reply. He fed the fire and did not watch her. He was not a man given to a great deal of internal commentary about events as they unfolded. He'd come to the territory as a practical person and had gotten more practical over the 3 years he'd been here, the way the country tends to make you, because impracticality has a high cost in a place where the weather is serious and the distances are long and there is generally no one coming to fix things for you. A woman had been down in his snow. He had brought her in because leaving her was not something he could do and remain himself. The complications that arrangement might produce were real, but they were not the present emergency, and he did not borrow tomorrow's trouble tonight. He served the broth. She sat up to take the bowl, moving more easily than he'd expected for someone who had been that far under, and she ate with concentration. He noticed that she watched the fire while she ate rather than watching him, which he understood as a reasonable strategy. The fire was not a threat. The storm ran through the night and into the following morning. By dawn it had dropped another 8 inches, and the temperature outside was somewhere around 10 degrees by the feel of it, which made it a good morning to stay where you were and do nothing complicated. Wyatt banked the fire and went to the barn to see to the stock, and came back to find Ayanna on her feet, moving carefully around the main room in the deliberate way of a person taking the measure of a space. She had folded the blankets and left them squared on the bench. She had done something with her hair, rearranged it, he couldn't have said exactly how, and she stood in the pale morning light from the window looking like someone who was making decisions rather than someone in need of rescue. He put a pan on for coffee. From the window, without turning, she announced that his horses were safe. He looked at her. How did she know about his horses? She'd been able to see the barn from the bench the night before, when the fire was bright and the window was dark outside. She'd watched them while he slept. The roan mare had been restless for a while. She'd settled. He absorbed this and said nothing for a moment. He remarked that she spoke English well. I learned it at the school at Fort Stanton. A brief pause. I left the school at Fort Stanton. She delivered both sentences with the same flat tone, which put the space between them. What happened at the school that made leaving the correct choice, clearly off limits? He did not push. He had some idea. He offered coffee and she accepted. They drank coffee by the fire while the snow continued outside, and she explained, without being pressed, something of how she had come to be in the hollow by his fence. Her band, Day from the northern Sierra Blanca, had been in their winter camp above the tree line when a cavalry detail came through 3 weeks earlier. Not on patrol exactly, but moving through with a kind of purposeful roughness, looking for a family that had left the reservation without papers. The family they described bore no resemblance to anyone in her band, but the soldiers had taken the food stores as a precaution against the band providing provisions to the escapees, which left 53 people going into winter with nothing. The band had moved south toward lower elevations, looking for game. The hunting had been difficult. She had separated from the main group to track a deer east toward the Sacramento slopes, and the storm had come in faster than she'd read it. 53 people. Wyatt looked at the window and thought about what he had in the barn, the half-side of elk, the dried beans, the salt pork he'd put up in October. What he could spare without cutting himself short of a winter. He did the arithmetic in the way of a man who has learned to think in terms of what things actually cost, not what they cost in a world where more was easily available. When the storm passed, he'd put together what he could, if she could point him to the camp. She fixed her attention on him with the particular quality you give to a thing you're trying to read correctly. Why? It was a fair question. He thought about how to answer it honestly. Because it's the right thing to do. And because you'd die in the next storm if they don't have food. She held the question a moment longer. Most men of his kind, she put it, didn't reason that way about her kind. He knew it. And he was not most men. He looked at his coffee when he said it, not at her, because saying something like that and holding someone's gaze while you do it puts you in the position of waiting to be believed, which is a different kind of claim than just saying the thing and letting it stand. She studied him a moment longer. The camp was 2 days north and east of here, above the tree line near the white rock face. She could draw him a map. The storm broke the following afternoon. Wyatt spent the intervening day doing what needed doing on a ranch in winter. Checking the horses, repairing a section of the north fence that had partially collapsed under the snow load, splitting more wood than he expected to need because his calculations about the winter had been recalibrated by recent events. Ayanna moved through the house and around the barn with a self-possession that made the space feel less like a place she was imposed upon and more like a place she was assessing. She was good with horses, which he noticed because the roan mare who shied at strangers did not shy at her. She found the split in the barn siding where the wind came through and showed him, without comment, where the cold was getting in. He patched it that afternoon. By the second day he had stopped trying to figure out the correct social architecture of a situation that had no clear precedent in his experience. She was there. He was there. There was work to do. They did it. On the third day, when the roads were passable, they rode north together to find the camp. The day winter camp was where she had placed it on the map, sheltered against the white rock face in a natural alcove that the wind went around rather than through, a good campsite chosen by people who had been reading this country for longer than his people had been in the territory. The 53 people of her band were in poor condition but not in crisis, which he understood as a tribute to how well they knew what they were doing. The elder who came out to meet them on the trail was a woman of 60 or so who looked at Wyatt with a directness he found easier to meet than the sideways suspicion he was more accustomed to from people who had decided in advance what he was. Ayanna spoke with her at length. He waited. The elder looked at him again and made her assessment known through Ayanna. He had a good face but stupid eyes. She meant it as a compliment. A clever man hides his face and shows his eyes nothing. Wyatt did the reverse. He did not know what to do with this. He decided to accept it as good faith and relayed his thanks through Ayanna. They unloaded what he'd brought, the elk, the dried goods, the salt pork, 2 bags of dried corn he'd meant to sell in the spring. He would need to replace them, which was a real cost, but it was a cost he could absorb. The elder watched the unloading with a practical attention that reminded him of the way he watched deliveries, counting without appearing to count. When they were done, the elder had one question, relayed through Ayanna: why? He looked at the elder directly. Because your people need food and I have some to spare. And because Ayanna was near dead in my snow, and bringing her back seemed worth doing, and this is part of the same thing. The elder looked at him for a long time. She said something that Ayanna did not immediately translate. What did she mean? Wyatt asked after a moment. A brief quiet. Then Ayanna passed it on: a man who does the right thing for small reasons is more trustworthy than a man who does it for large ones. He was not sure he fully understood that, but it sat right in his chest in some way he didn't try to analyze. The ride back to the ranch was quieter than the ride out, the way silence sometimes gets more comfortable rather than less when two people have been somewhere important together. He did not invite her to stay. She did not offer to leave. When they reached the ranch house and he put the horses up, she was still there when he came back inside. Neither of them mentioned it directly. Wyatt expanded the north pasture, which he'd been planning for 2 years and had deferred. Ayanna began a kitchen garden that would take the summer to establish but would pay dividends in years to come, not the modest, apologetic plot of herbs that the territory ranch wives typically kept, but a serious garden organized by what the soil and sun required, incorporating plants she knew from the mountains alongside the standard issue things a man bought at a general store. She was not apologetic about her knowledge. This, he had come to understand, was one of the central facts of her character. She had been educated at the Fort Stanton School and had absorbed what the school offered, and had refused to be diminished by the framework the school assumed, that its students were empty vessels being filled with something better than what they'd had. She had learned English and arithmetic and something about the territorial legal structures and had kept everything she already knew with the same clear hand. The result was a person who moved through 2 different knowledge systems without being divided by them. She was teaching him. She was also, on the subject of cattle management, being taught. This seemed to her the normal state of things. Not a transaction where one person was permanently more expert and the other permanently more ignorant, but a conversation that shifted depending on where you were and what the situation required. He had found, over the course of the spring, that the most useful things he was learning were not skills exactly but orientations. A way of reading weather before the instruments registered it, a way of approaching the horses that reduced their tension rather than managing it from outside, a way of understanding what the land offered in a given season rather than insisting on what he needed from it. These were the kinds of knowledge that don't come from books and don't come from short acquaintance with a place. They come from a long relationship between people and specific land, and they do not transfer except from one person to another, slowly, over time. He loved her. He had not put this into words yet, which was a deficiency he noticed but had not yet corrected, because he was a person who moved slowly toward the most important things. She loved him, he believed, in the way of a person who would not have stayed, and would not have stood on the porch beside him, and would not have said she wanted to belong in this place, if something of that order were not true. But they were both people who said things when they were ready to say them, and neither hurried the other toward declarations. He said it in May, on a morning when the sky was the specific blue of high altitude and the mountains to the north were clear and the horses were visible in the north pasture, moving in the easy way of animals that have nothing pressing on them. "I love you." She was standing at the fence looking north. She turned. "I know." Not dismissively, she put it as the statement of a fact she had been carrying and was glad to have confirmed out loud. He acknowledged that it took him a while to say things. She'd noticed, she answered. She loved him too, since he was being explicit about it. He looked at the mountains. There was a quality to the spring light on the Sacramento slopes that he had seen before but now understood was going to be one of the permanent textures of his life. The way it came in long and golden in the mornings, laying itself across the grass and the rock in a way that made everything look both immediate and ancient, as though the present moment and the deep past were the same light. Ayanna had shown him, one afternoon in March, the place on the white rock face above the tree line where her grandmother's grandmother had left a drawing, 2 figures walking together across a slope, rendered in ochre, simple and enduring. He had stood and looked at it for a long time and felt the weight of being present in a history enormously longer than his own. She'd made the point quietly, standing beside him at the rock, her ancestor walked this mountain. And Ayanna walked it. And now he walked it with her. The summer brought its own complications and its own grace. Kane and the people who shared his view of how the county ought to be organized did not disappear from the landscape. The social friction did not evaporate. There were mornings when Wyatt went to town and felt the particular temperature of being talked about, and there were transactions that took longer than they should have, and one that didn't happen at all, a buyer for 20 head who suddenly wasn't interested after a conversation with the wrong person. He absorbed these costs without making large events of them. Ayanna had her own social territory, her own navigation. She went to Tularosa twice a month and managed the social landscape with a composure that he could see was a performance, not a false one, but the kind of performance required of people who exist in spaces that are not designed for them, and who have developed the skill of moving through those spaces without surrendering the thing inside that the spaces are trying to reach. She was not diminished by it. He observed that and found it one of the most impressive things he had ever watched a person do. In August, a cavalry detail came through on the same route as the one that had taken the winter stores from her band. This one had clearer paperwork and a more regular purpose and was led by a lieutenant who seemed to be functioning within actual orders. The detail stopped at the ranch to water the horses. The lieutenant was civil. He noted, without inflection, that the Apache presence on the mountain had been a matter of some attention, and that if Wyatt had information about reservation compliance in the area, the army would be interested. Wyatt replied that he'd seen no one out of order. The lieutenant acknowledged Ayanna with a formal word, she returned it with a single word rank, the horses were watered and the detail moved on. When they were gone, Ayanna came to stand beside him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. It would keep happening, she put forward. He knew. There would come a time when holding this position had real costs. There had already been real costs, he pointed out. Bigger ones coming, she pressed. He looked at the track the detail had left heading north and acknowledged it, yes. And they would meet them when they came. She put her hand on his arm, briefly, the way she did when she was making a point without making it large. He put his hand over hers. They stood there a moment in the August light, looking at the mountains. The thing that was hardest for him to explain to anyone who asked, though fewer people asked as the year went on and the arrangement became simply what it was the particular quality of the life that had resulted from the decision he'd made in the blizzard. Not the good part specifically, not the fact of her or the thing that had grown between them, but the quality of existence in a place where the present and the past ran together in ways he hadn't previously understood. He had come to the territory 3 years before in the way that people come to new places, carrying his own history but not much else, expecting to make something from the land without having to reckon with what was already in it. Ayanna had not changed that expectation by arguing with it. She had just lived in ways that showed him its limits, and over the course of a year he had begun to see the landscape differently, not as a thing he was making, but as a thing he was becoming part of, which was a different undertaking with different demands and, he thought, a longer future. His nearest neighbor, Henrik the German blacksmith, put the observation to him once, over a beer in the saloon in Tularosa. Wyatt seemed like a different man than the one who'd come to the territory in 1878. Wyatt thought about it. Same man, came the answer. Better company. Henrik laughed and set down his glass and said that was the kindest explanation he'd heard for it. The house had changed. Not dramatically, he was not a man who changed things dramatically, but there were differences that accumulated. The kitchen garden was a visible one, the serious organized plot Ayanna had started in March that by September was producing more vegetables than the two of them could eat, and had established the beginning of the perennial plants that would take 2 more years to fully bear. The interior had changed in small ways, a different arrangement of the blankets, the addition of certain things on the shelves that had not been there before, the way the fireplace lay from the ash of different woods. There was a smell to the house now, pine and sage and the particular quality of a fire managed by someone who knew exactly what temperature they were trying to maintain, different from the smell of a bachelor's ranch, and one he would have missed, he understood now, the same way you miss a thing you didn't know you had until it was present. There was the matter of how the space had organized itself around 2 people with different habits and different knowledge of the world. The kitchen utensils hung at a different height than he'd kept them, optimized for her reach. The single shelf above the fireplace that had held one item, a cracked compass that had stopped working in 1879, now held a small collection of dried herbs and the bones of a bird she used to read weather. The firewood was split differently than he'd split it, shorter pieces that caught faster and held a steadier temperature, and he'd adopted her method because it was better, the way you adopt any better method once you see it working. These were not large things. They were the material evidence of two lives adjusting to each other, and they had the particular quality of changes you don't notice happening, and then one day you look at the room and understand it has become something different from what it was. In October, as the first cold of the new winter settled over the Sacramento mountains, Ayanna let him know at the kitchen window, matter-of-factly, with her coffee in hand and the frost on the north pasture beyond the glass, she was pregnant. He sat at the table and did not say anything for a moment. Well. She turned to look at him. Something cautious was in her face, not fear, but the caution of a person presenting information that might land unpredictably. He got up and went to the window and stood beside her. Good news, he put it simply. The caution in her face shifted. Yes, she agreed. It is. They stood at the window together, looking at the frost on the pasture and the mountains beyond that had been her grandmother's country and were now their country, the light coming long and thin from the east, the horses moving in the way of horses who know that winter is coming and are not particularly bothered by the knowledge, because they have been through winters before and they are accounted for, they are in a good place, they have what they need. The blizzard that had brought them together was gone 12 months now into the country's long memory, reduced to a reference point, the thing before which certain things had been different and after which they were not. He thought about it sometimes, the 70 yards of fence line in the dark and the cold, the instinct of the roan mare shying left. The narrowness of it. What did not happen, on most nights that winter, in most 30-yard stretches of fence line in the territory. He did not think about this with a great deal of drama. He thought about it the way you think about the last step before a doorway, how close the threshold was, and what it cost to cross it, and how the house is different inside from how it looked from the snow. He looked at Ayanna at the window. He looked at the mountains behind the glass. The Sacramento mountains in the morning light, white-capped now with the first snows of the new season, the slopes going brown and gold where the aspens had turned, the rock face where her grandmother's grandmother had left her drawing, two figures on a slope, the ochre still bright, still asking to be read. He thought of what Ayanna had put to him about that pattern, that you make a thing for one purpose and it serves another one later, because the world keeps changing. That she would have liked that it was used. He put his arm around his wife's shoulders. She leaned into him, slightly, without making a ceremony of it. Outside, the first real snow of the new winter was beginning to fall, gentle this time, nothing like what had started this story, but real enough, white enough, the kind of snow that settles and stays. They watched it come down through the window glass, standing together in the house they had made from what the territory offered and what they had brought to it, while the mountains held their ground behind the weather, as they had always done and always would.